Definitely some emotion today for me, and I wasn't exactly sure, um, if I should even try to do this today. Earlier in the week I thought like I'd be fine, and last night I was like maybe this was a bad idea, um, but it's a lot of distraction and a lot of things on our minds as a family emotionally, and we have a lot of faith in Jesus. He's been so good and faithful for a long time. So these are those moments where we look in our history, we look in our story, and we see the fingerprints of God, and it helps gives us faith. But yeah, there's fear, there's ups and downs. Like you have times of riding some highs, and times of feeling low, and all of those emotions that come with it. And I just wanted you to know, I didn't have to speak today. Like I think everyone would have maybe understood, and I think I had. The option to not. I just kind of thought, hey, maybe it'd be good to be together. I just thought that, and then I thought, it might be a good idea to, I don't know, give myself something to focus on, like, and so, I'm not a very spiritual reason. I just I needed a distraction. So like writing a message isn't, that's kind of what I did. So, I love you guys, and today's not super polished, and I just want to share some things from my heart, if that's good. We've been in a teaching series called Followers, and I've loved this series. I love teaching through the Gospels. I love teaching through the story of Jesus and his life, and the purpose of this series has really just been for us to kind of talk about what does a follower of Jesus look like. I think that's what we're trying to be, more than just someone who says, hey, I'm a Christian, or I identify with Jesus. It's like, what does it look like to follow him, like with our lives? And so, I look at that and I think about that. And if I'm just being completely honest, I think one of the hardest parts for me when it comes to following Jesus is that I hate to follow. Like, I am not a follower. Like, I don't like to do what everybody else is doing. I don't know if any of you are like that. I like to do things my own way. I've always been that way, like everyone's doing this, I want to do something different. And it's always been true of me. And I think sometimes what it comes down to is just like pride. This need sometimes to be uniquely different or to feel special. And so the problem with that is that it can make it very difficult to follow Jesus in a meaningful way. Because in order to follow him, what that means is that I'm going to have to do the things that other followers are doing. And so when it comes to following Jesus, there are these like broad brush, strokes in terms of like spiritual disciplines and habits that are true of everyone, including me. Things that like we all do as followers of Jesus. And there's not just these like broad brush stroke spiritual habits and disciplines that are true of everyone except for me. Like it's true of all of us. And if we want to follow Jesus faithfully, if we want to know him, if we want to be the people that he's created and called us to be, sometimes we have to work past that issue of just like struggling to follow. Where like we don't want to do the things necessarily all the time that everybody else does, or we think maybe there's a shortcut to where we want to end up, and there's really not. And so what I've been doing this week is thinking a lot about this question of like, what does Jesus really mean to me? It's a question that I think we all wrestle with at times, and it's a question that I probably answer differently based on seasons of my life. I think there's probably times where I feel like when life is good, maybe I answer it one way, and when life is harder, it makes you think, right? Makes you stop, makes you pause. You're not as quick to answer it maybe the way you would when life is good. And so I've been thinking through this question of like, what does Jesus really mean to me? Not as a pastor, not as a spiritual leader, not as a father, not as a husband. What does it mean to me? Like, who is Jesus to me? And I'll tell you, like, man, there's been times in my life where I have followed Jesus and I have felt so much closer to him. And there's times where I have felt like far from him, times where I felt distant from God. And there's been times when I would tell you that I have followed Jesus closely, and times where I have maybe followed at a distance. I don't know if any of you can relate to that, but what I think is this, is I think that there is a tendency in most people to follow Jesus at a distance. I was thinking about that idea, because I can kind of chart moments throughout my life where it's like, he's still there and he's still a part, but it's like, I don't know that I'm following him as closely as I could or should or need to. And I was thinking about, years ago, when we were living at a time before we had GPS in our pocket or in our cars, and you had to follow a car, somebody to get from one location to the other. They're like, oh yeah, you just follow me, we'll get there. And especially if you're doing like big city traffic, how easy it is for other vehicles or things to get in between you to where, you maybe lose sight of the car that you're following. Y'all remember that? Like, I'm going to have to explain this to my kids. I don't think they understand. But I think this happens to us all the times as followers of Jesus, where we can maybe be guilty of following at a distance. I think for me, the times when my life has been distant from Jesus, have been when I've become so caught up in things that don't really matter. Things that don't need to be as important as I make them. I think of times where, or things like sin or bitterness or offense or unforgiveness or worry and panic and fear and all those things have just been allowed to live in my heart. And maybe you can relate. The default reaction usually is like Adam and Eve, where you just want to hide from God. You're not sure that He wants to be near you. You're not sure that He's pleased or happy with you. And so, it creates this distance where it's not like I'm not following Him, it's just I'm not following very closely. And the problem is like when we head down this path of following at a distance, our perspective, our vision of life, the way we see things, the thing that captivates our vision, it can just start to shift so dramatically towards something that it really should not be on. And so I probably would just say it to you like this, that following Jesus closely requires a vision of Him that is so clear that nothing else compares. The problem is that too often other things can get in the way. And when I think about this phrase, like this statement right here, right, having this clear vision of Him, man, I don't know that that's like as easy as I make it sound. Like being caught up in Jesus, like really being like sustained by Him. Being known by Him, like walking with Him and knowing Him in a way where man, there is this clear picture and vision of Him in my life where nothing else comes close. Sure, there's other things that matter and other things that, man, we get distracted by, or other things we spend time on, but nothing compares. When I look at my life, I can see, fears and insecurities and panic and worry and offense and, money and pride and all the things that just get in the way. And what I've noticed about my life, and maybe you can relate, is that I cannot follow Jesus very closely until those things are removed. And it's not that I'm not following, it's just that I'm not following very closely. It's like these are the things that they're like those cars in traffic that just sort of get in the way, and it creates distance, separation. I can't I'm not on the bumper like I want to be following the car to where I need to go. I'm like asking the person next to me to stick their head out the window and see if they can still see the car, because there's all these things separating me from the car that I'm trying to follow. And it reminds me of some really powerful words from Dallas Willard in what I would say is one of his best books, called The Great Omission. And he says the first and most basic thing we can and must do is to keep God before our minds. This is the fundamental secret for caring for our souls. Our part in thus practicing the presence of God is to direct and redirect our minds constantly to Him. In the early time of our practicing, we may well be challenged by our burdensome habits of dwelling on things less than God. But these are habits, not the law of gravity, and can be broken. I don't know if any of you can relate to what he's saying here. It's me, right? It's my life. I see how often and how easy it is to just be kind of pulled into thinking about things that don't really matter, being consumed about things that are, just going to feed fear and worry and all the panic and things like that. And there is something, very supernatural that can happen when we set our minds on things above. That's what Colossians tells us to do, right? And so what that requires is us to kind of lift our gaze, to lift our focus out of what we're dealing with now, what's going on in front of us, to kind of see like a bigger vision, to see a bigger picture, to get caught up in something that's bigger than just what's right in front of us. And that's why I would just tell you, I think that like to follow Jesus well, we have to have a Jesus-shaped vision for our life. It has to be like what we get caught up in, and so he makes it really, I think, profound when he says, we have these habits of dwelling on things that are less than God. But to remember kind of like how the runaway train in our minds just can take us places like we that aren't helpful, that aren't good for us. And sometimes we feel like, man, that's just who I am. That's the way it's always going to be. Well, I've always been that way. I always think that way. I always react that way. And I love his thought here, right? That these are habits. They're not the laws of gravity. That they can be broken. They can be changed. They can be reshaped. And when I look at the Gospel of Mark today, Mark 14 is where I want us to be. And there is a story of a woman here that amazes me. It's one of these stories that I don't know how to, I don't always know what to do with, because it convicts me. I don't always read it and feel awesome about my own apprenticeship to Jesus. It inspires me to want to go to another level. But we see a story of a woman here in Mark 14 who I would say was so captivated with Jesus. She had a Jesus-shaped vision for her life, and nothing else seemed to really matter or come close to comparing. And I want to just read this story to you. There's 11 verses, and we will just talk about it. Is that all right? Starting in verse 1, it says, "Now the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away." I just want to stop there and just kind of give you some context, because how many of y'all remember that at the time of Jesus' betrayal, right, him being brutally mocked, beaten, and ultimately handed over to death happened at Passover, right? So this is right before that. This is at the very end of Jesus' ministry when this story happens. I mean, people are wanting him dead. They're conspiring, like he is just hours at this point from being handed over and brutally beaten and crucified. And we see it explained here, right, that the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and to kill him. But not during the feast, they said, or the people may riot. They were very careful. They were cunning. They knew that they couldn't handle the mob if it turned against them, and so they were trying to kind of push every button perfectly and pull every lever to kind of manipulate the response that they wanted out of the larger crowd. And it says in verse 3 that while Jesus was in Bethany, he was reclining at the table in the home of a man known as Simon the leper. It says a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. In verse 6, "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial." And look at verse 9. He says, I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Right? This is like right before things get interesting. I love this story. It's powerful. Like, there's all these different characters in the scene, and what I love about it is, like, we clearly have two principal characters. We have a lot of background people, but there's two sort of principal ones outside of Jesus, right? We have two people that I would say would have been thought to be close followers of Jesus, right? We have this woman who comes and pours this perfume on Jesus' head, but then we also have Judas. How many of y'all know Judas was one of the 12? One of the 12 disciples, and I think he would have been considered a close follower of Jesus. How much closer can you be? You know, how much closer as a follower can you be to Jesus than to be within his 12, you know, like who are going with him everywhere. And yet what happens here is Judas, when he looks at this woman's love for Jesus, he thought she was absolutely crazy, outside of her mind, to the point that himself and others had felt that she had gone too far, that she had gone overboard, that what she was doing there was a complete waste. And instead of being inspired to follow Jesus like this woman, Judas became offended, and he went away to conspire with the chief priests and the elders about how to betray Jesus and hand him over. It's amazing, right? To see the contrast. It's a sharp contrast between a woman who is caught up so much with a Jesus-shaped vision for her life that she'll give anything and everything to follow him and worship him, to a man that everyone assumed was already at that place, becoming so indignant, becoming so offended that he could sit there and judge the kind of worship that she was giving to Jesus. Here's a question. What is it that angered the people in this story? Why were they so upset? Here's the answer. I think it's because they saw in this woman something they did not have. They saw something they didn't have. She had something they did not possess. They thought they were following God closely, but in reality, maybe they weren't. And so you have these religious leaders, these chief priests, these elders. You have Judas, one of the 12, and they've all probably convinced themselves that they're following God really closely. They had at least projected an image outwardly that most people would have assumed they were. I mean, most people didn't consider them hypocrites. Jesus did. But most people didn't look at like the Pharisees and the chief priests and the elders and think, hypocrite. Most people looked at them and thought that they were the standard. Jesus saw through the exterior, and he called them called them out, called them for who they were. And so these chief priests, these elders, these Pharisees, like what's going on is they've been walking around with like their heads held high, thinking that they're doing like a great job. And in walks this woman with this alabaster jar, and she breaks open this expensive perfume. She pours it out on Jesus' head, and all of these people who thought that they were following Jesus closely realize that they're nothing like her. They saw in this woman something that they did not have. There's something in the way this woman responds to Jesus that shows that there is something that she has discovered that the other people in the room had yet to discover or experience for themselves. I want to just say it to you like this. I think that you'll never become the person God wants you to be by accident. How many of y'all know that? Do you know that to be true? Like it's not something you just like stumble into, or you roll out of bed and like become the person God wants you to be. Like it's not accidental, it's intentional. So you don't develop your spiritual potential passively, right? It's something that you have to like lean into. It's something you have to pursue. It's something you have to chase and go after. Because how many of y'all know we don't live in a neutral world? We live in a heavily contested space. We're all being formed into something. We're all being formed into someone. The question is, are we aware of what those forces are, and are we aware of who we're becoming? All of us are consciously and unconsciously moving toward the model of what life is supposed to look like according to someone's definition or expectation. What the good life is supposed to be. There's stereotypes that abound everywhere. Like when it comes to what it looks like to be a man. Does a man drive a truck and watch sports and drink beer? Like stereotypes abound. Is that the good life? Does a man lift weights and hunt? Do women shop? Do they decorate? Do they set out to prove themselves? In corporate America and just kind of push back against some of those ceilings that have been in place for a long time? Or do they stay home and do they nurture and take care of the family? Do they focus on every external thing about themselves that people can see, beauty and appearance and fashion and all those things? And I'm just telling you, like stereotypes abound about like what the good life is, and about like when you chase it, it's supposed to bring some level of fulfillment. all the things I mentioned are stereotypes, and it's not that they're bad. It's not that they're sinful. It's not that they're evil necessarily. It's just oftentimes what they really should be described as is just a distraction. The things that we become caught up with, the things that we think we need to chase and possess and have. But as a follower of Jesus, the vision of what you're called to become is not defined by stereotypes, scripts, or strong opinions. We're called to become like Jesus. I think of that very famous scripture in Hebrews chapter 12, right? The author of Hebrews writes, and he says, to lay off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, right? That's what the scriptures teach. And I think we get that on some level. Like, we can start with sin and go, okay, I know what it's like to be entangled. I mean, I'll know what it's like to be entangled, right? Like, I get that, and I know that doesn't help me. But before that, he says, lay off everything that hinders. So he's not just talking about sin. The question is, like, does it help you run? It's not about whether it's good or bad, whether it's right or wrong, whether you can or you can't. The question is, like, does it help you run? Does it help you run the race that is marked out for you, the spiritual life that God has for all of us? Look, spiritual formation does not happen in a vacuum, and I wish it did. Man, I wish we all could kind of like just sort of unplug from life. I wish we all could just maybe try to develop our spiritual lives in a vacuum, in like a monastery as monks, and do it that way. Maybe we'd get further down the road quicker. But the problem is that we live in a heavily contested space. And it's so difficult sometimes to just walk out and live out our spiritual life the way we need to, the way we're supposed to. We're surrounded by forces that want to form us into the exact opposite image of Jesus. If you think about what some of those forces are, I mean, like, secularism has shaped us to believe that God is distant and that he's irrelevant, that he's not involved in our life, that it's up to us to kind of figure things out. Consumerism has shaped our understanding of like what life is supposed to be like, what we're supposed to chase. That we're to believe that our preferences have to be met and that the goal of life is fulfillment and ease and comfort. And if I can just have, all of those things, if I can never want a day in my life, if I can just have all the comfort, that's like what the good life is. Let me tell you, like, it is a current in culture. And it takes us oftentimes to places that, like, we are not meant to be, places we're not supposed to go. And without a Jesus-shaped vision for our life, we will get caught up in going after things that do not appear to be sin on the surface and that can probably be justified on some level, but they don't necessarily help us run. We live in like a therapeutic culture, right? Shapes our view of victimhood and agency and possibility and all of those things. And the truth is, like, what I've been trying to say is, like, becoming more like Jesus in a world like this, it's hard. I wish we could just unplug. How many of y'all could use like a month at like some convent just to kind of get your spiritual life kind of developed the way you need it to be? But it doesn't work that way. We live in a heavily contested space. And the person that God is trying to form you into has to fight against those rhythms, has to fight against those forces, has to push back, has to resist. Because all of us are being formed into something or someone. And the question is, do we understand what those forces are? And are we being formed in the person that Jesus wants us to be? I look at the story in Mark 14 and it amazes me, right? And I look at this woman and it is extremely convicting. It makes me uncomfortable. In fact, I've only ever taught on this story once in my life. It was 20 years ago. Because I read it and I appreciate it, but I don't know what to do with it. Because I don't think that's where I'm at very often. Because this woman has something that I don't know that I always possess. She has what I would call reckless abandon. It's reckless abandon. Let me define it this way. Reckless abandon is acting or doing something in a way that is unrestrained, careless, and without regard for potential consequences or conventions. So most of the time, right, when we look at the idea of reckless abandon and we think it's something to avoid. We think of this as something that we should not do. We think of extreme risk takers. We think of people who do not hedge their bets, who do go all in, who are a bit reckless with their ideas and their pursuits, and oftentimes get in trouble. And maybe there's like the rare occasion where someone, risked it all or doubled down or tripled down, and like it worked out for them, but they're not they're the exception, not the rule. And we look at people who live lives like that, and oftentimes we're like, man, that is crazy. Like, who could live like that? And I think that when we look at this woman in this story, what we see is an example of reckless abandon. We see an extreme risk taker. And I want to kind of just maybe try to underpin why I think that there's like this reckless abandonment in her with like a few thoughts that I pull out of the story, a few things that I notice. The first one is I just noticed that she has no regard for her appearance. Do you notice that? Let me look at this. I think it's in verse 3. It says, while Jesus was in Bethany, right, reclining at the table, in the home of a man known as Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? All right, so just frame it up. Picture it. Jesus is in this room, and he's surrounded by a mixed crowd of people who love him and people who are conspiring to kill him. Right, the chief priests, the elders, Judas, right, they're trying to figure out a way to arrest Jesus because Jesus was going around talking as if he was God. He was going around talking as if he was the one sent by God, the Messiah, the long-awaited one, and it was troubling to people. They thought it was blasphemy. And in the midst of like that sort of context, in the midst of that dynamic in the room, people who are for and people who are against, people who love him and people who hate him, in walks this woman with an alabaster jar of perfume, and she comes in with one thing on her mind. She comes in with one thing on her agenda, and that was to honor her Lord. That was to worship her Lord. And I think she knew how people would view her. I think she knew the risk. I think she knew that most people who were watching wouldn't understand. And so we're told in the story that she brings this jar of, it's called nard. Other translations call it like a spikenard. And it was the type of gift meant only for royalty. Very expensive. What I think is interesting, the detail that I catch is that not only does she open the jar, she breaks it. Like she intends that for it to be given in its entirety to Jesus. Nothing is saved. Nothing's held back. She breaks it open. She's not saving any for another day. Man, I think of like a sports analogy. I think of the way, announcers or people might speak of an athlete after a game when they'll say something like, so-and-so left it all out on the field. You know what I mean? What do they mean when they say that? They're communicating that, whether that, that athlete is walking off the field in victory or in defeat, like they could walk off with their head held high. People could cheer and clap because it's obvious that they held nothing back. They put it all out there on the field. And that's what you see in this woman here in this story. She holds nothing back. She breaks it open, gives it all to Jesus, and you see that she's not concerned with what others might think of her. She did not care if she looked foolish. She didn't care if she would be judged. She wasn't interested in pleasing others. She's only solely interested in pleasing Jesus here. In fact, I would say that had she cared about how she appears to others here in this story, we probably would have never read about her. We'd probably never know this story. And I think we have to kind of like just remember this. Like all of this is being taken in by those watching as a complete waste. I think that how we appear to others oftentimes keeps us from giving Jesus the type of commitment he really wants from us. We kind of wonder what they'll think. I don't know what kind of, sometimes we come from families that like don't understand why we serve Jesus the way we do, and so we, it holds us back. We're not exactly sure that that's like, that we should be at that level of extreme when it comes to following Jesus. In fact, we're kind of conditioned culturally, when we think about other religions that have fanatics or extremists, that like that's something to look down on. And perhaps it is in pagan or false religions and cults and things like that. But what happens is we can copy and paste that mindset onto like our faith life and think that like we should not be fanatical or extreme. That somehow we should be in the middle. Somehow we should play it safe. That we should hold something back. That we should be proper. That people shouldn't see emotion. That it's we should hold back passion. And all of that stuff. And I can't help but like look at this woman and just see how she just does not give a rip. She doesn't care like what other people think about her. I think the problem sometimes with modern day disciples is our tendency to put more value into what other people think of us instead of what God thinks. And so what happens is we kind of possess this inability at times to just look foolish for Jesus. I think that your resolve to follow Jesus in what I would say like is like a radical sense, man, it's never going to make sense to people. It will always kind of appear as a waste. You're going to have family that don't get it. You'll have friends that think, man, like you used to be way more cool. Like you used to, like what happened to you? Why are you not fun anymore? Those kinds of, you'll have those things. Like what a waste, man. You used to be way more fun. In fact, I was looking on Facebook yesterday. I saw this guy on there who attended a church that I used to pastor at years ago, and man, he was really caught up at one point in like drugs and alcohol addiction, been in and out of prison many times, and just lived a really hard life, biker gang life, and he's since like really found Jesus, changed his life. And he was commenting on there about how there's these people from his past life who basically are mocking him, mocking him for like the life he's chosen. And I thought that was just so interesting. And he's sitting there going like, man, like who would think? I get it if you don't want to live the way I live, but who would think that you'd make fun of someone who's found love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Like, who makes fun of that? We're going to have to get past our appearance and how we, what people think of us. I think if we're going to follow Jesus faithfully. The second thing I see in the story for this woman is that she seems to have no regard for the cost. Do you notice that? So she brings this alabaster jar, very, very expensive perfume. And as I already said, she breaks it open and she pours it out on Jesus' head. And when I say expensive, I mean very expensive, right? So The plant that produces nard, it's actually found in the Himalaya mountains, and it was very rare, very, very rare. So the perfume is like really expensive. You think about this, like, Israel isn't exactly super close to the Himalayas. It takes a little bit. Like, and so it's just hard to come by. And supply demand, like, it just makes it difficult. It's rare. And the Bible here in the story, it says that this jar of perfume could have been sold for a year's wages. That's what the Judas and some of the other onlookers are upset about. Like look at how expensive this is. We could have sold that. We could have taken the money, given it to the poor. Obviously, they wouldn't have done that. That's not really what they wanted to do. But they were sitting there in judgment, and with their their religious elite mindset, trying to just judge an act of worship that they would never do themselves. The Bible tells us that it was worth about a year's wages. So it's basically worth about 300 denarii back then. It's about a denarii or two a day is pretty much kind of what the living wage looked like. Man, this translates somewhere to around like $50,000, like in our world, like whatever, cost of whatever like a average year's salary. It's probably more than that. And depending if we're looking at like inflation and adjusting for that, like maybe like either before or after the election, I'm not sure. I think it's changed a little bit, but come on, guys, come on. Still the guy. So what you need to understand is that this perfume, like, man, it was a gift that was, you'd only give this to like a king. And it shows you how she viewed Jesus. A couple weeks ago, Jason had the chance to speak, and he highlighted the rich young ruler. And I look at the story of him and the story of this woman, and man, you can't see like a bigger difference, right? Because unlike the rich young ruler, like, this woman comes to Jesus and she literally gives everything. It's this radical commitment. You see this whole, like, when I look at like this room, when I look at like our all of you here, and I think about the people in first service, and I think about our church, I think, man, there's a lot of desire. There's a lot of good desire. I think a lot of desire in us to follow Jesus. And yet, like, I can't help but just remember how much desire the rich young ruler had. Like, he really desired to follow Jesus, but when he found out what it was going to cost him, remember, he went away sad. It was just more than he wanted to pay. And what I love about this story here in Mark 14 is that the woman here refuses to let anything keep her from giving Jesus her best. Like, there's no price that's too much or too great. There's no cost that's going to hold her back. And I think that she had been able to ask and answer the question of, like, what does Jesus really mean to me? Not what does Jesus mean to my family? What did Jesus mean to my parents? What did Jesus mean to, my friends? What does Jesus mean to me? She was able to answer that. And from that answer, she walks into a room full of people who like Jesus and people who don't, and she has laser focus, and she comes in and she worships Jesus in a way that, it's hard to describe. I wonder if you'd ever be willing to waste your life at the feet of Jesus. That's really what she's done here. Because the third thing I want to just maybe point out in this story is that this woman had no regard for the future. She's not thinking about tomorrow. She's not thinking about a year from now. She's not thinking about 10 years from now. She's caught up in the moment. She's like transfixed on Jesus, and like there's nothing else that matters. She basically wastes $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 on Jesus right there. And people thought, man, that's wild. I think a lot of us would feel that way too. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean you're doing that? Like, Think about all the good you could do. See, the thing about their culture back then was that they really had no 401k plans set up. I mean, any financial planners, you wouldn't have had a job. No markets to watch. So retirement was unique. As people would age and get older, like they'd work as long as they can. But even especially for women in the ancient Near East, there was just not. They just didn't have any options. They couldn't purchase and acquire and invest. They weren't even allowed to give testimony in court. Their status in society was so low that oftentimes they'd have to look for other ways to kind of build worth or build wealth, and to kind of wait for either a rainy day or wait for when their bodies would break down and they couldn't work anymore. And so sometimes they would invest in different ointments, or they'd invest in these different perfumes or these things that were very valuable, and maybe they'd set them on a shelf and they'd keep them there. And so as they neared maybe an age where they couldn't work as much, they would sell those, they'd cash them in, or maybe if they had a big life event, unexpected, they'd take those things and they'd convert them to cash, and then they'd have that resource that they needed. And doing this would just allow them to survive financially. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that this woman could have quite possibly just wasted her entire future at the feet of Jesus. All of her security at the feet of Jesus. You think about maybe what her vision of life had been maybe at one point. To get her to a place where she's investing and setting aside and waiting and planning for the future and doing all the responsible things, something dramatically has to happen in her for her to say, man, I don't care about tomorrow. I don't care about the next day. I don't care about what happens next week. I care about this moment. And I'm not going to let it pass me by. Man, I don't know about you, but usually when it comes to commitment like this, man, I struggle. I struggle with letting God have full control of my future. Struggle. I need Him to talk with me about it. But I believe that in order to find God's plan for our life, we have to be willing to sacrifice our plans. We have to be willing to lay down our hopes. We have to be willing to lay down our dreams, all of those at the feet of Jesus. You know what I'm saying? No regard for her appearance or the cost or her future. Doesn't care what is going on around her. She just comes to Jesus and she empties her life right there. And I'm blown away by verse 9. Because Jesus picks up on the snickering, he picks up on the judgment, he hears what Judas and some of the other disciples might be saying and the chief priests and all of that, and he looks at them and he tells them to leave her alone. Just stop, leave her alone. He says, the poor you'll always have with you, but me, I won't always be with you. He says this in verse 9. He says, I tell you the truth that wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. You think about that. What Jesus is saying is that, hey, for the next 2,000 plus years, whenever the gospel is preached, I think about how small, like the church began as just a group of 120 people on the day of Pentecost, and it just begins to expand and grow. A couple hundred, couple thousand, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, to the point that it brings the Roman Empire to its knees, but not through violence and force, through enemy love, through selflessness, through caring and looking after orphans and widows. And Jesus says, hey, he's basically acknowledging something's about to happen. What's the good news of my life, the gospel, it is about to go all around the world. And every time it's taught, every time it's preached, every time it's shared, this story of this woman will be shared in memory of her and what she did here. Why? Like what? Why? Why is this story that important? Because this is the type of worship that it's like the stuff of legends. It's rare. Most people don't worship like this. Most people don't live like this. And he's saying, this is the goal. This is where I want you to be. This is how I want you to see me. This is how I want you to love me. This is how I want you to worship me. Break it open. Hold nothing back. Give me all of you. Give me your best. And I just want to say to you this morning, like, I think that we need a Jesus-shaped vision for our life. We have to remove some of the traffic that keeps us from following close. We got to have that Jesus-shaped vision. Look, nothing else compares when compared to him. Amen? I was thinking about, some things this week about how I've taken time to study over the years about the early church and just how they grew like that. The first 300 years were just remarkable, exponential growth. And yet it was illegal to be a Christian. And every time, persecution broke out against the Christians, like they just grew. It's like the great irony, right? You try to kill it and it grows. It doesn't stop. And there's these stories that I read in some of these like extra biblical historical books, that are fascinating to read. There's some examples I read in I think the 2nd century where there were these Christians who, they were arrested, they're about to be put to death, hung. And they're brought into kind of like a room, an open area where like people are watching and just kind of cheering on their execution. And as they're doing that, like the tone begins to change as they watch these Christians like speak love and forgiveness to those who are about to take their life. And there's these stories. I don't know how often this happened, but there's these stories of these onlookers being so moved in their heart that they like responded to Jesus in that moment after watching these Christians just love their enemy and pray for them, and to the point that even just again, I don't know how often it happened, but there were some occasions where some of the people would step out of the crowd of onlookers and join the Christians up there to get persecuted. And I don't know, like, I don't want that. You don't want that. It's not the goal. We thankful we live at the time we live in, pretty safe. I just look at that and I see, man, like, that's a Jesus-shaped vision for your life. Nothing else compares. Nothing else matters. Would you stand? Would you bow your heads with me for just a moment? We're going to take a minute and worship. We're going to sing a song as we close. And I want you just to close your eyes with me, and I want you just to sort of imagine in your mind's eye that you are in that first century housing structure all those years ago. I want you to imagine the ancient, dirty streets, dusty roads, stepping into this building that is packed. It's full of people. It's a mixed crowd. And I want you just to imagine what it would be like as you're walking through this building, this room, this house, and you're trying to get past people. None of them are giving you any attention. None of them are even really notice that you're there. And if they do, they're probably talking amongst themselves, wondering, why you even came in the first place, because this isn't a party that you were necessarily invited to. And I want you to imagine yourself in this room and you're walking through, and imagine what it must be like as you kind of get around this group of people and your eyes begin to see Jesus. And there he is. That's the object of your affection. And I want you to imagine what you would do in that moment and how you would worship. Do you think that maybe the crowd would sort of fade into the background? What would it look like for you to get caught up in Jesus to the point that nothing else really mattered? And what would it look like for you to run up to him and just waste your life at his feet? And man, if you're here today and you would just say, Pastor Jordan, like I need my life to look this way, reckless, abandoned. I am at a point, it's time to waste my life on Jesus. Could I just pray with you today? Could I just see your hand? It's all, right? I don't know how many hands I could put up. Jesus, I pray right now for just great passion, great love to just fill our hearts. Give us everything we need. I pray that you would just inspire us to have laser focus. Give us that Jesus-shaped vision. Let our eyes stay transfixed on you. Lord, I pray that no matter the cost, no matter what you ask, God, that we would not hedge, we would not hold back, but we would break our life open and pour it out at your feet and watch what you can do with it. We thank you that there's none better and none greater, and we give you our highest praise. I want to just invite the prayer teams forward. If you need prayer today for any reason, you can come forward and you need healing in your body, emotions, your mind, just going through something, want to respond to this message in some way, our prayer teams will be here for you. But I'd love for us to take 2 or 3 minutes and just imagine ourselves in that first century housing structure and imagine what it would be like when we first lock eyes with Jesus and catch a glimpse. And I want us just to take some time here to worship in a way that is worthy of that kind of response. Can we do that right now?